we'll get through this together. Then I got a bit of a cold, so I'm gonna, yeah. I'm a little foggy. Oh, this is for you guys, so we use some of these. Pass those down. Good. So, wait till those get handed out, and then we'll walk through it together. If it's got hieroglyphics, then we're on the right page.
I'm gonna use
Start in the upper left-hand corner where it says energy systems. So that was the first talk. So we've got that in the can, it's on the Slack page, so you can all go back, reference that. Really good information, especially as we go into the winter, to identify those energy systems. Second talk was the elements of the stroke, which is this guy right here. And if there was a bunch of people here, there may be questions there because they may not have seen that before. But basically what it is that if we look at the stroke as having 6 basic elements, and then we want to identify where the root causes or root problems are of a given element of the stroke, we identify that element and then we work backwards. So I'll just show you this really quick. So here we have our boat, and then you see the arrow, the boat's going this way, right? Blade enters the water here, exits here. So this is everything about the stroke except for this section right here. Right? And that's on your sheet. So we have a dynamic finish, exit square, clear the water, level hands, early roll-ups, and get locked on the water. And so those are basically the 6 elements of the stroke where people get hung up. And let's say, you know, if somebody's not rolling up early, if we go to here, we're not going to solve it here. We need to go backwards. We need to go behind that 1, 2, 3 steps. So if we're having an issue with early roll-ups, well, we need to make sure we have level hands so that there's space to allow for that roll-up. And if that's not happening, if we're not getting level hands, then we're probably not clearing the water on the exit. Right? Why aren't we clearing the water on the exit? Because we didn't exit the water square. Why aren't we exiting square? Because we didn't have a dynamic finish, right? So even though the sequence is going clockwise, we're going to reverse engineer that sequence to identify the root cause. Okay? So there's that. Then this section right here is what we're going to work on today, what we're going to look at today. So in 2016, so if you go to your sheet, top right-hand corner where it says power mechanics, in 2016 I got invited to be part of a study with Charlie Adams and Valerie Klezhnev. And Charlie's a friend of mine, former competitor. He's a coach at Leicester University in England. Interesting little side note, one of his young women, 22, was in the British quad that won gold in Paris this year. So that was pretty cool. And then Klezhnev is on the British national team. He's a sports scientist. He's Russian, but he's been with the Brits for a long time now. And he's kind of like the geekiest guy in rowing science. Like his stuff is so over, you know, it's very dry, but it's real. So, you know, if you want to get really sciencey, all of his published work is out there.
Can you spell his name? Or
Valerie.
Put it up there?
Sure. And I think I saw something of his just recently in like the last U.S. Rowing magazine. But he's pretty prolific. A lot of his stuff is out there. So, but he's anyway, published stuff. So the examples I'm giving are actually real examples from that work that we did in 2016. So what we were doing was we were looking at handle velocity as it relates to peak power. Well, peak velocity and peak force, and you combine those two things, and that gives you power. Okay? So from the point of here to here, we're going to measure that in terms of percentage of displacement. So all that means very simply is that point A to point B, that's from 0 to 100. So if we graph that, it looks like this. Okay, so when my blade goes into the water, that's 0. And when I take the blade out of the water, that's 100. And so what we want to do is we want to measure that power from 0 to 100 to find where the peaks are as a percentage point of the total distance traveled. Okay? So these examples then, you can see the little thing I drew on your sheet there. Let me see if I can draw this fairly well. So the first one is 40 and 82, and peak power at 171. So that's going to look something like this. We're going to have one guy. That's 171, so that's going to be something like this.
So this was using specific individual rowers?
Yes, using rowers with load sensors and pressure plates. And then so there would be our peak force, and then our second velocity is on this one is at 63%, 171. So, 63, no, that's the other one. 82%. So that's going to be way out here.
And then did you evaluate who was the most efficient based on where they peaked? Where the peak?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one example. So in this example, with a top speed of 1.71 meters per second. Now that has nothing to do with boat speed. That's handle speed. So that's 1/3 of the equation, because what's really happening, if my handle is traveling from here to here at roughly 5 miles an hour, the boat's traveling past the blade at roughly 15 miles an hour. Right, so it's 2/3. Yeah. Right, because the travel on the inboard section of the blade is what's being measured, but that's a very short distance. The travel 12 feet out at the end of the blade is much greater.
Oh.
Right. Okay, so 171 for that green guy. And then this other one was 4363, and that was at 209. So it's going to be up here somewhere, and it's going to be just after this one.
And what did the 209 mean again?
Let me write the one
Okay.
more arc and I'll explain. That's 43 and 63. And so this one is going to be right about here. Like that. Okay, so the 2.09 is just meters per second.
Okay.
And then the other one is 1.71 meters per second. So what we're looking at then is velocity and force. And what you'll see is that in the red example, the two peaks are fairly close together, right? They're only 23% differential between 1 and 2. But when we look at the green one, they're quite a bit further away from one another. That disparity is like 62%, right? So the distance from here to here versus the distance from here to here. And so if you cover the covered area in a graphic representation, then is your power, right? It's load and speed. And you can see when these are closer together, you're moving faster because you're combining better body mechanics with acceleration and force. Does that all make sense? It doesn't, graphic representation is a very different animal from how you might interpret it on the water. But the takeaway here is that you want to get these two peaks as close together as possible. If they actually overlapped, that would be the best possible scenario that way. And then this is just talking about the power mechanics, and then if we can combine that with the boat mechanics such that that power peaks in the middle of your power arc, then we've done our job, right? And so that's the bulk of what this little craziness here is gonna be. Is we're gonna look at gearing and rigging, biomechanics, and then power versus range of motion. Is that everybody kind of with me on that so
Sort of.
far? Okay. And yeah, what I found the most fascinating about this is that this is just two examples, but there are so many variations on this. And so getting back to your point, is part of it's mechanical as to what the equipment is doing, and then the other part is biomechanical as to what is the rower doing. Because if the rower, you know, if the rower is entering, here's your power, let's just say this is your power arc here. So if the rower is entering the water here, and say they're just jamming on it, right? All the force is coming here, which is kind of like this green example. Their peak force is coming on at roughly 40% displacement. But their peak acceleration isn't coming on until past 80%. What did I say? 82%. So that, in terms of your stroke, that's way out here, right? So you've already blown through most of your power arc. If you're reaching peak acceleration at about the time you're ready to take the blade out of the water, that's the wrong place to be, right? So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the maximization of power, which is the overlap of speed and load, and get it to drop right into this power arc, that 90-degree 45, right? Which is that right in there. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Well, good with that. So, and then, as we discussed in the last talk, this varies. It varies by boat design, it varies by the size of the boat, the type of boat, by the rower as well. You know, what kind of body does the rower have? So we want to try to set up the rigging so that it optimizes the individual, which is, I hope you guys know, is practically impossible if you don't have consistent lineups. You know, if you have a boat that you're training for an event and you train that lineup, then you can rig that boat to match the athlete. That's kind of how it works, right? Now, when it doesn't work, then we have our basics. You know, we go with basic rigging, basic measurements, and then we can sort of fine tune. Yeah. There's some like basic examples would be like taking 8 oars and throwing clams on them to row 4. Right? You've solved one element of the problem without accommodating the other elements. So it's an easy fix, it's not a complete fix. And the reason for that is that if you change the inboard-outboard equation, you also have to change the rig to accommodate that. And that's your spread and your sweep. If you don't, or your span, excuse me, your spread and your span. So if you don't adjust the spread and the span, you may have changed the gearing by increasing the inboard, but you've also changed the arc. So you're going to do more work through a wider range to get the same distance traveled. So it's like, it would be like if you're going 60 miles an hour and you're in 5th gear, you're in overdrive. See, back in the day there were stick shifts, so just think like that. Well, if you kept the same speed but downshifted to 4th, you'd be doing more work to get the same thing done. And that's kind of what putting clams on without changing the rig does. It gives you better leverage, but you're going to travel a wider arc faster through the water, so you're going to have to pick it up quicker and expend more energy to get basically the same work done. Shorter distance, that might be a good thing. Longer distance, that's terrible. So, okay. Yeah, anyway, that's that. 2 different examples, actually the same rower, just different measurements based on different load profiles. Not going to get into rate. We're going to leave the rate stays constant for this because that's another variable we don't need for this particular example. Okay, so if we're kind of clear on that, then I'm just going to get into these other elements here. Any questions so far? No? We're good? All right, so gearing and rigging. So we're talking about power mechanics. So we talk about boat mechanics versus biomechanics. And so here we have inboard and outboard, which we just discussed, the spread and the span relative to inboard and outboard. Then we have foot stretchers, foot stretcher height. How far to the stern are you? How far to the bow are you? What's your foot stretcher angle? Thank you, Cheryl, for reminding me of that yesterday. So yesterday we had the 8 out, and Cheryl was not looking right in my eye, and or bow pair, 1 and 2, same thing. They weren't matching up with the rest of the boat. We changed their foot stretchers to match the catch angles. That worked out really nicely. In Cheryl's case, it was different. It was the angle. It wasn't the height. She was already down. We only had one notch left to drop her down, so we weren't going to see a huge difference there. But she had a really steep foot stretcher angle. So that was preventing her from getting up to full compression, right? So the opposite is, what if we had a really shallow foot stretcher angle? Then you're going to get over compressed and lose power. So that goes all the way to the very last thing. If we follow all the arrows, it goes all the way to power versus range of motion. So those two things are totally connected, which is why there's a little tiny arrow going back to the beginning again.
It's interesting because I did feel like, I'm not getting compression, but I just figured I was getting used to this new boat, or I didn't understand why.
Yeah, and
I thought it was me.
And because we're putting that boat up for the winter, it's kind of a non-issue, but if we weren't, we would fix that, right? And if you were gonna be rowing in that seat consistently, we would change that. So I was gonna bring a 2x4 so I could demonstrate that, but a really good, and I didn't, so. But a really good example would be if I'm doing a squat, right? If I'm squatting, back squat, front squat, back squat, and I squat down, keeping good form, my chest is up, all that good stuff. I'm only gonna get so deep into that movement because of the biomechanical limitations. Compare that to if I put a 2x4 down and I stepped on that 2x4 so my heels were raised up, I would then be able to get a lot deeper into that squat staying vertical. So I would increase my range of motion, but I would not increase my power. I would actually lose power because I would lose my mechanical advantage even though I get deeper. So we relate this to rowing. More reach isn't necessarily better, right? If I'm over compressed and overreached, I may grab more water, but I'm going to be weaker for it, right? So there's a huge trade-off there. And usually power wins over range of motion.
Except for Diane.
Yeah, unless you're inhuman, you know, if you're free, like Diane is. We're not taping this, she's never going to hear that. Anyway, so, well, there's a great Steve story about that. What's his name, the Canadian coach? Sprackman, Mike Sprackman, and Jim Sims was at a US rowing conference, and Sprackman was talking, and so Steve has a pretty unorthodox style, right? He hunches over and he pulls in like this, and I'll catch hell for that at some point, but it's true. And so Jim raises his hand and he asks Sprackman, and he goes, "You know Steve Kiesling?" And he's like, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, what do I do with a guy like that?" And he goes, "You let him do whatever the hell he wants." And that's the answer, right? So rowing doesn't always have to be perfect, it has to be effective. But when we're learning to row, it's not a bad idea to start with the basics. And the basics of good mechanics is a really good place to start. And then if you have your own quirks and your own style, and that still makes the boat go fast, that's great. So, okay, that was a Dayquil enhanced tangent right there. Okay, so yeah, foot stretchers, that's a big deal. Blade design, huge, and we're seeing this in our club right now, right? The blades that we use in our club, some of them, the first big blade designs are massively heavy, and the profile of the travel of that blade creates an extremely heavy finish, right? It makes you feel like a rock star at the catch. It's great, but then it gets heavy really fast. So unless you're a heavyweight men's boat, that's a terrible blade to have. And in fact, Concept 2 doesn't even make those anymore for that reason. And if you go on the Concept 2 website and look at their blade designs and their recommendations, they have a disclaimer on their own website not recommending big blade design. It's completely obsolete. We have 2 sets of them in our roadhouse that we should not be using, so we should probably take these out.
At one time, though, that was the standard or something?
That was the new design, the evolution of the hatchet design, yeah. And so that was before the Fat Smoothie design. And then the Fat Smoothie design became the Smoothie 2 and the Fat 2, and they diverged. But yeah, at the time it was heavier is better. You know, if we want to get as much displacement as possible, we want to grab as much water as we can. And the load profile is just very, very heavy.
Do you happen to remember what the name was of the oars that we had at the boathouse?
Yeah, I've got a whole inventory. We have big blades, we have a couple of sets of Fat Smoothies, we've got a Smoothie 2, we've got a Smoothie 2 Vortex, which is a nice set. SOU has a really nice set. And then we have this new Washington set, which is a smoothie design that is really good. So once I get those sanded and painted, that'll be a consistent. But right now, Galaxy is our best seller.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big deal as well. Keep that in mind. And another example of that, just to go on that for a second, is that let's say you have a heavy blade. Well, maybe for 1,000 meters, that's not such a bad thing. But if you took that same blade and tried to do a head race with that kind of load, it would tear you up. You know, you would get tired and slow. So there's the other things. What's the duration of the event? You know, what's the distance traveled? That's all gearing related. Okay. All right. Any questions about that?
Yeah, for sculling blades, I was told by Corinne, like in a quad, they all need to be like the same measurements. Is that?
All the same within the boat?
Yeah, the four.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Yeah, unless something's, yeah.
Well, because everyone has different blades, that's the thing too.
When you say different blades, are you?
Different style blades, yeah, we have the fatties, right? The ones that Rick bought quite a few different, he bought 2 different styles.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, the same rules apply. You know, different blade designs are gonna have different loads, different load profiles.
So keep it all the same.
Okay, so no, I'm not saying that. So you're saying 2 things. So one is the inboard, outboard. That should be the same.
The measurement, okay,
Yes.
and then what about the blades?
So people have different preferences.
Okay,
So if somebody has a specific design blade, they probably have it for a reason.
okay,
Yeah, and it's not uncommon to see different blades within a boat.
okay.
Yeah, the key is you want to have your inboard, outboard all be the
All
same.
the same.
Because you want your catch angles to be identical, you want your releases to be identical.
Okay.
You could rig the boat, I mean, again, it goes back to if you have 4 people and they're training year-round together, you can do whatever you want, you know. In terms of how you want to manipulate the rig relative to the person, relative to the seat in the boat. Think about all your contact points, right? So your foot stretchers, your seat, the rig itself, the handle, all of those things interact. So usually the general rule of thumb is you want to reduce as many variables as possible, and that just gives you a lot more control over what you're doing, and then make one change at a time. Yeah. So if everybody has the same inboard, outboard, and then you want to change from there, that's fine. But as long as you do one thing at a time and don't shotgun it. Okay, so that gets us to, if we're cool with the rigging part of it, we can go to biomechanics. Does that sound good? So then it gets into, what's the body doing now relative to all these things that we just went through? Are the body angles good? Do you have tightness or imbalance? Orthopedic vestibular baggage that you bring with you, right? So, which means whatever, if you crashed your bike when you were 7 years old and you're still carrying fascial memory from that, that's orthopedic baggage, that there's gonna be some compensatory mechanism within your body that you're coping with. And that's human, so it's not a big deal, it's just we wanna recognize that. Hamstring flexibility, hip flexibility, tib fib versus femur length, right? Everybody's different. Some people have really long femurs, some people have really long tib fib. So those things also play into, okay, how high should my foot stretcher be? Relative to my really long tibia, right? So that's another important part. How long are your arms? How long is your spine? All that stuff. If you have a really long upper torso, this sounds counterintuitive, but I want that person to be extra careful not to overreach, because they could and probably would given half the chance, right? If I've got a really long torso, I can really get out there. Well, if I really get out there, I'm in a weak position. I need to keep my chest up, and I need to keep square with the path of the oar handle, so that my power is going to apply directly. I don't have any weak link in that kinetic chain. Okay. And that leads right into consistent patterning and sequencing. So we talk about in rowing, there's no perfection, but we can achieve consistency. Right? We want to be as consistent as possible in all elements of the rowing stroke, not just the drive. And so our patterning and our sequence, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get it right, and then we're trying to reinforce it. There, we sing, you get your 10,000 hours and hope that you get them right. Because imagine if you did 10,000 hours of rowing and you weren't doing it right, and you're just reinforcing all the wrong crap. That'd be too bad. Then you have to start all over. So, or find another sport, I don't know. So that's super important. So then we go over to the other side of that page, consistent patterning and sequencing, and we look at some of those elements within those patterns and sequences. Like I said, tight shoulders, you know, making sure your chest is up, making sure you're not looking down into the bottom of the boat. Hip and shoulder position. This is a big one. So when we talk about hip and shoulder position, we're talking about right, so here's my shoulders. It's a terrible picture, but there's my knees, there's my feet, right? So the key is I want to make sure I'm in a position where my shoulders are in front of my hips, right? So that when I start driving off the foot stretchers, that I'm driving this way, this angle hasn't changed, right? When I finish my stroke, I get into body prep position, that angle doesn't change as I come up the slide. Stays uniform, stays consistent. I engage, I lock the blade on the water, I start my leg drive, same thing. Angle doesn't change until until the handle passes my knees, then I swing over, right? If I don't establish that forward body angle, when I get to the catch, if I'm bolt upright, well then I've opened my back too early. What happens here? I lost all my force, and I lost my ability to accelerate that force because I gave up all of that travel that allows for that acceleration. Right, so I partially completed my stroke before I even started my leg drive. That's bad, right? You don't want that. So it's super important. This position, you know, you want to ingrain that in your muscle memory. That's where you should be before your knees get to quarter slide. You know, you want to be at that angle. All of your prep, all of your body prep takes place before you start traveling up the slide. And that never, ever, ever changes. Doesn't matter whether you're doing quick drills or you're doing straight. That sequence is always the same. Questions about that? Cool. All right, so hip, shoulders. And then below that I wrote opening back too early. Well, again, byproduct of not getting enough forward body angle. Don't have it, you're going to open back early. Breaking the arms early. This is another one that I think happens more in sculling than in sweep rowing. Because sculling blades are so small and light and nimble, there's just a tendency to do this. You just sort of grab this way, right? We want to grab this way. So that's a lot harder to do with a sweep oar because it's big and heavy, and it kind of just feels like, oh yeah, this feels more natural to do this. Whereas the tendency to grab with your arms with sculling oars, I think, is just more prevalent. But I always go back to the idea of you're going to lift a car, you go up to the bumper to lift the car, you're not going to get in that position and then do this. Because that's going to be impossible. You're going to lock on and use your body to lift it up. And the arms aren't going to do anything. They're going to be totally straight. Well, it's the same thing in rowing. You're going to get the most power by engaging the entire body and letting the arms hang completely open. And then the arms come in last. Okay. Shooting the slide. There's another one that has to do with core connection. So this goes back, we can use the deadlift analogy, works really well. I'm sure I've done this with many of you on the ergs, is if you go up to the catch and I grab the handle and I have you apply leg pressure against it to the point that it lifts your butt off the seat. The idea is that, going back to this drawing, is that when I start moving this way, this point and this point need to be moving at exactly the same speed. That's how we maintain that angle, right? If this is moving faster, what happens? I open my back. If this is moving faster, what happens? I shoot my slide. And when that happens, what really that indicates is you've lost your core connection. So your core strength is your ability to connect a lower extremity with an upper extremity. That's what core strength is by definition. So we need to engage and make sure that these two joint structures are moving as a unit at the exact same speed. And that's how you preserve the integrity of translating the power from the foot stretcher to your Okay. So that's kind of the pattern and sequencing side of the equation, and so then we go, following our little cheat sheet here, we go to proper squat mechanics, biomechanics. So similar here, right? Deadlift mechanics, squat mechanics, clean mechanics. The things you learn in weightlifting apply directly to how you move a boat. So those mechanics, those patterns translate very, very well from lifting to rowing and vice versa. They'll keep you from getting injured, but more importantly, they'll reinforce how to accelerate a load. So let's clear up a couple of misnomers. Weightlifting, the actual term weightlifting refers to Olympic weightlifting. And Olympic weightlifting is a power sport, and power means you're taking a load and you're accelerating. This is where it gets stupid. Powerlifting has nothing to do with power. Powerlifting is a strength movement, three strength movements. It's deadlift, squat, and bench. It's a very specific niche in the world of weightlifting, and for whatever reason, they decided to call it powerlifting, even though there's no power component. So it's a little confusing. Rowing is a power endurance sport, right? So rowing, the power equation is massive in rowing. You're taking a load, you're accelerating that load. That's what power is. So super important to recognize the difference. And that's, again, one of the reasons why Olympic-style weightlifting translates so well to rowing, because they're the same thing. They're taking a load and accelerating that load. With one differentiation, and that is when you move a load in the free weight world, that load becomes variable, right? So we talked about this a little bit last time, like constants are variable, variables are constant. If I take a weight, if I take a 10-pound weight, and it's sitting there by itself, it's 10 pounds. Once I start moving that weight, it's no longer 10 pounds. When it's in motion, it's now variable. So when I take a heavy weight from the ground and I pick it up into a clean position, which is effectively what a rowing stroke is, the difference is that as I accelerate that weight, it's getting lighter. When you're rowing, you don't get that luxury. When you accelerate, it's still heavy all the way to the end. But we're losing mechanical advantage as we go to the finish, right? We're moving from big joint structures and big muscle groups to smaller joint structures and smaller muscle groups. So it's important that we continuously accelerate all the way to the end to overcome our own mechanical disadvantage.
I was gonna say, it gets easier if you wash out.
Yeah, oh yeah, then it's great. It gets easier if you don't pull hard.
Yeah.
Then it's a piece of cake, right? Yeah. Yeah, so really good things happen when you pull hard all the way to the end, and really bad things happen when you don't. It's just when you commit to having a dynamic drive all the way to the end, the boat sets up much better. Blade comes out of the water much easier. All good things happen. If you are not confident, if you're anticipating the next stroke, not wanting to be late, not wanting to get stuck, you will get stuck because you'll take the pressure off the blade will get stuck in the water. And then what you do, you'll probably compromise and just feather on the water to get it out of there. And that ruins all of that. So, but we've already talked about that.
So you don't want to, which I have done in the past, is really crank it in though.
Right. Yeah, you want a fluid power, the dynamic sort of a consistent acceleration all the way to the end. And usually that comes from sort of the muscle-it mentality, and that's just, our own inclination is like, I'm going to pull hard, and you sort of rip on it or yank on it, and that disruption also disrupts the power application. So getting a nice smooth power all the way through to the end, definitely the way to go.
I think I'm getting better at that.
Yeah, absolutely. As are we. Yeah, good. And again, this is relevant because we're going into the winter, and strength training is a big part of the programming when we get into our symmetry, hypertrophy basics for winter training. Super important. So any other questions on that? Proper mechanics for lifting and they translate to rowing? Yeah, okay. Everybody semi-awake? Now we get into sufficient strength relative to body weight. So this is just pointing out that strength in a vacuum, it doesn't do a lot for us. What we really need is strength relative to body weight. So there's relative strength, there's absolute strength. There's functional strength, and those can be different things. Here's an example. If I've got a 300-pound guy and he can squat 300 pounds, that's pretty awesome. If I've got a 160-pound guy and he can squat 200 pounds, well, that's not as much weight as the 300-pound guy, but who's relatively stronger? Smaller guy is, right? Because relative to his body weight, he's lifting more weight, right? So with my 300-pound guy, I'd rather race him than the 170-pound guy, because when the 300-pound guy gets in the boat, that's displacing that water, right? That's pushing the boat down into the water. He's got to push all that weight or pull all that weight. So the phrase pulling your own weight, that's a rowing phrase. So it's relative strength. So that's why we adjust our ERG scores, right? We have age adjustments, but we also have weight adjustments for just that reason. So because using that same example, if I'm picking an athlete for a boat and my 200-pound guy is racing a 150-pound guy, and the 200-pound guy gets a better score and it's not weight adjusted, that's not going to play out on the water unless there's a huge disparity. But we need to weight adjust it and find out what really, or you just see racing. But yeah. Okay. So relative strength is the most important measurement for rowers. Absolute strength, pretty irrelevant. Functional strength is also irrelevant for this conversation, but yeah. And then lastly, power versus range of motion. So, which we kind of talked about with the foot stretchers. Other examples of that, there's a great basketball one, which is if you wanted to jump really high. If I wanted to, without blinding myself, if I wanted to jump up and touch the ceiling, I'm only going to compress so far before I go this way. That's called plyometric. So there are 3 phases to a plyometric movement, and that amortization, when I get to the bottom of the eccentric load, to load up those muscles to spring the other way, there's a certain efficiency there where I go past a point and I'm going to lose that efficiency, right? So the example is, if you took a picture of somebody jumping to catch a rebound, they're going to only compress so far and then they're going to jump. But what if I went here and I told a person to jump as high as they could from this position? I'm going to spend all my energy getting out of this position to even get to a point where mechanically now I can actually jump. So by the time I get here, I'm so fatigued from getting out of that hole, I'm actually weaker. So it goes back to rowing, right? If I'm super compressed, if I'm over my knees, if my seat is against my ankles, and I try to drive, I have no muscular power in that position. The mechanical advantage is long gone. Really, optimally, I'm at 7/8 of shins vertical, right? If I'm past that point, I lose all my mechanical advantage. I may get more reach, but I'm not going to be as strong, right? So that's that. That's the whole talk, guys. Look at that. 40 minutes. We're out of here. Any questions about that? No?
No, it made sense.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Good. So now, do you guys don't have to know all this stuff about rigging. Hopefully you've got a coach or a boat person or somebody that's going to be overseeing that. It's a good idea to know that those variables exist and to have a general understanding of the impact that those variables have. But I wouldn't stress too much over it. If you have questions, you can always come to me or somebody else that knows this stuff. But it's just important to realize that it does have a huge impact on your rowing. Rowing's not just about just pulling hard.
Yeah, and I can see the difference in my single. I had major changes in it this summer.
Yeah.
So I was feeling like something wasn't right.
Yeah.
And then Joe and Corinne, you have to move this, you have to move that, and then all of a sudden, everything kind of like felt better. So, and I think it's a process of learning, about your body and how well like for me in my single, how well I fit in that boat.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes having a second set of eyes, or a third or a fourth. Same thing Jessica had that in her single, where we just made a few simple tweaks and a huge change on her load profile and how she was accelerating that boat. So no, it's profound. Makes a difference.
So the goals that we all have that same art.
Yeah, sure, that would be nice. Yeah, the load profile should be the same, you know. Yeah, it makes it, you know, it's more difficult, you know, if we've got a lot of different body styles, but if we have consistent lineups, we can work around that and customize that. And if you have the time, trial and error is super important. You have to get on the water and try these things. You have to make small changes and then test it. And then make, you know, it's like being a para rower for years, it'll drive you insane. Not that I'm suggesting you all go insane over this stuff, don't. But you can really get into minutia, and sometimes you'll end up full circle. Oh yeah, well, it was actually the best, you know, when we first started, but it's worth exploring.
Well, you learn more.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
get a better understanding of it.
Changes how you row too. You know, you can, you know, maximize how you're gonna make the boat move, based on the rig. Okay? All right, thank you guys, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Especially when you're dealing with a cold.
My tea is still hot, this is perfect.